Hello, everyone. My name is Adrien Zakar, and I'm the co-host of this event today.
And my name is Marwa Elshakry. I'm an associate professor at Columbia and the co-moderator for today's event.
And we're thrilled to open the second season of Technologies of Power, in which we host a group of speakers every other week this spring, following a first successful season in the fall. This adventure started 2 years ago as we were thinking critically about the technological legacies of the war on terror since the turn of the 20th century. In Africa, in South Asia, in the Middle East, warmongering and the technologies upon it rests has led to immense destruction. In part, growing out of this litany of material loss, new devices for knowing and framing past and future have emerged. Drones, aerial sensing and mapping, the mass digitization of text, algorithmic machine reading, and the first 3D printers.
So in this second season, we consider various forms of critical praxis that could be said to have emerged in response to the critical concepts or diagnostics of the technologies of power we discuss in our fall series. Today's event considers one such potential form of critical praxis as a defining feature of the global war on terror, namely opacity. Indeed, as a concept, particularly when paired against transparency, opacity initially emerged in the context of military cover-ups. Yet, as our speakers will show today when considering forms of insurgent aesthetics, confronting opacity can allow one to both critically register and potentially counter that which is visibly invisible. In this sense, then, it creates new sensory engagements with and visual representations of the seen unseen. Meditating on this double-edged interplay between opacity and visibility, we ask at least two major questions then. First, what forms of aesthetic praxis or sensory engagements best bring this interplay to light? And second, what forms of resistance can these engagements create?
You can find the full biographies of our speakers posted in the chat. I will introduce them briefly now. Our first speaker is Nada Shabout. Nada is a Regent Professor of Art History and the coordinator of the Contemporary Art and Muslim Cultural Studies Initiative at the University of North Texas. She's the founding president of the Association for Modern and Contemporary Art from the Arab World, Iran, and Turkey. Our second speaker is Simone Brown. Simone Brown is an associate professor of Black Studies and research director of critical surveillance inquiry with Good Systems at the University of Texas at Austin. She's currently writing her second book manuscript, Like the Mixture of Charcoal and Darkness, which examines the interventions made by artists whose work grapple with surveillance. And our last speaker today is Rona Capady. Rona Capady is Associate Professor and Director of Graduate Studies in Gender and Women's Studies program at the University of Illinois at Chicago. His first book, Insurgent Aesthetics, Security, and the Queer Life of the Forever War, published with Duke University Press, won the 2020 Surveillance Studies Network Book Award. Please join me in welcoming us today.
So let me explain how we're going to run today's event. Each of the speakers have pre-recorded a brief presentation. Play all three videos and then open the floor for discussion and questions. Please note too that we encourage the panelists to engage each other's presentations. And of course, we encourage the audience to ask questions and post comments in the chat or in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. So once again, welcome to the three of you in particular, and we are very much looking forward to an engaging conversation. So our first presentation is by Nada Shabout.
As I stayed in Baghdad, I saw my city, the city in which I was born and raised, through eventful years, starting with the war with Iran and ending with the fall of Baghdad. I saw my city wailing under vicious bombardment, its skies full of missiles, being destroyed, burned, looted, violated in all its being, details, history, and structure. And I saw it become a city of ghosts, thieves, and robbers. In this book, I documented all of the details which represent the most atrocious events in the modern history of Baghdad, and I do not believe it will have an equal. I documented the looting of its museums, burning of its libraries, and desecrating of its history. This was a paragraph from the description by Iraqi artist, Karim Rissan, of his book, The Baghdad Burning, that he created in 2003. Now, the war in Iraq has been a very long war. Well, wars in Iraq have been, in fact, a hallmark of its contemporary age, starting with the Iran-Iraq war, and then a decade of debilitating sanctions by the US and allies, and ending in the 2003, and of course the Gulf Wars, and then ending in the 2003 US invasion of Iraq. For Iraqi artists specifically, this has been extremely disabling. So, through the sanctions, they were locked into the country with no view of the outside. There is no travel, there is no magazines coming in, no journals, but also there is no material for them to work. So it is an extremely stifling situation, which was sort of under the guise of the war on terror, which sort of disabled the trajectory and the continuity of historiography, the history of art in the country Iraq, which has been known for its mature and well-developed movement of modern art during the mid-20th century. So the contemporary artists, and particularly a generation known as the 80s generation, who basically came to their maturity in art under the circumstances of the wars and sanctions, are the ones to which Karim Rissan, the artist that I just quoted, belongs to. Karim stayed in Iraq for the most part, as many of his generation, because of the lack of the ability to travel, but because also of the lack of the ability to have material, as it was part of the sanction mandate, they would find material to use themselves in creating works. And that what sort of gave prominence to a trend that became known as dafater, plural Arabic word plural for daftar, which means notebook, and this is sort of the equivalent of an artist book, let's say. Interesting about these books is that they are created from found material, whatever is available. Clearly, size would make it possible for them to create, because, as we know, that wars and these circumstances don't really stifle creativity. They might try to delay it. But so under this sort of very confused, completely opaque existence within a country that has been very open and very connected, the artists had no other retort than to look inside, look at their museums, look at their own heritage and history. It manifested in the various documentations of dafatar that the artists were creating, as well as a style developed by artist Hana Malala, a contemporary of Karim Rissan and a colleague, a classmate of his, that she called ruination technique. A technique that she argues is sort of, not only stems, but is very representative of the reality that they were living in. That it carries historical narration that transformed a historically recognized and celebrated development of art history into destruction. Now, it is also this sort of connection with the museums that Karim Rissan and Hana Malala and their colleague had, which was denied for them in 2003 as well. I went to Baghdad in June 2003, straight sort of a couple of months after the invasion and destruction, to find a country that has fully lost its luster, as I had left it in 1980 to come to the US as a student to study. Not only that it had lost its luster, but people have lost hope. They had no idea how they're going to be moving forward, and artists included. There was no electricity, which continues to be a problem. There is no place for them in the international scene of art development. Even after 2003, and with the sort of quick turnover with internet connections and possibilities of connecting to other places, they really felt left out. Artist Hannah Malala often asked me, what about us? Where do we fit? Other artists of her generation asked the same question, as those other artists like Adel Abdin and Wafa Bilal, who left in the 90s and before and were able to find their place in the other parts of the world, whether here in the US or in Europe, were able to speak the same language of the global contemporary that the Iraqi artists felt completely absent from. The way that their vision was developing was completely in a cocoon, completely related to their own past, but also to their understanding of where or who's against them, who's their friend, who's their enemy. Media, right after 2003, was amazed to not find work of dissent or resistance against Saddam Hussein, which of course clearly misses the point of living under a dictatorship and wanting to survive. So, simple aspect of life survival is what the artists were working with, but also the reality that for Iraqi artists living in Iraq, making good art, creativity is their way of resistance. Now that takes me back to this format of Dafatar, which, in a way we can think about it stemming from traditional Islamic representation of manuscripts, except these, of course, are about the secular, the mundane, and very open, very creative. They don't follow any format in any shape or form, but they became the sites of existence, the sites of resistance, but also the sites of witnessing, of documenting, of telling the story of what was happening in Iraq. Some of those Dafatars found their way out of the country early on and are in major museums, but the reality is this format of articulating existence and development artistically as well as just as human beings, have not really been understood largely, despite of the latest sort of representation as part of the MoMA PS1 exhibition, Theater of Operations, about the Gulf Wars. They are not understood for the value of what they represent for the artists themselves and their ability to survive, their ability to continue their creativity. What they do tell us is how artists, as well as other inhabitants of the city of Baghdad or other places, dealt with the situation of the continuous war and destruction of their country. And it's really sad that we are not using them more to understand the situation. Is while, we don't really know where the war of terror has gotten to. The Gulf War has become part of our history. The US invasion is, mission accomplished by many. But the reality is, many of those artists that I just mentioned, Karim Rissan, Hannah Malala, they had to leave the country because their lives became threatened because of us on the outside trying to understand their art and bring it out. These Dafatar thus tell us much of the missed story of what had happened in Iraq under the war, which is not resolved by any shape or form, that is affecting what is happening in Iraq at the moment as we speak, but also the history of Iraqi art and its production and trajectory. Where is Iraqi art is as confusing as any other question that one would ask today. Is it inside of Iraq, which is completely still disconnected from its own history because the destruction of museum erased that part, and it's not really speaking on the same level of where the rest of the artists have been in the world, but also the sort of the diaspora Iraqi artists who have access to many other possibilities. I thus, really would love to see Dafatar as something that is more explored for us to understand this opacity of war and its disconnect, this sort of, cocoon that a part of history of the Iraqi art trajectory has been set in. Thank you.
There's a scene in the film Naz and Malik where an imam gives a brief greeting before the beginning of a prayer gathering. He says, "If you're here with the NYPD or you're with the FBI, welcome, sincerely, we expect you here." The spoken greeting is a recognition of, and perhaps a reckoning with, a seeming inevitability of police surveillance, monitoring, and criminalization of Muslim communities by way of, for example, the so-called Countering Violent Extremism program and the New York Police Department's now disbanded demographic unit, or sometimes by infiltrations of mosques and Muslim student groups by plainclothes cops, or through the work of FBI informants, and by the way of create and capture. One need only to look at the thousands of pages of declassified FBI files on Malcolm X, Elijah Muhammad, the Nation of Islam, and the FBI's Operation Vulgar Betrayal, as revealed in Asia Bindawi's 2018 documentary, The Feeling of Being Watched. Although declassified, these files still disclose, by way of non-disclosure memos and black and white opaque redacted box, the extent of the state's targeted actions. In the film Naz and Malik, two Black queer Muslim teenagers move in and around Brooklyn, New York, by foot, by bike, and by train, all over the course of one day. Their conversations throughout the day range from topics such as the rapid gentrification of Brooklyn, or the Quran, and bystander intervention and incarceration, and profiling at airports. At one point in the film, they're approached by a white, greasy-haired undercover cop who attempts to entrap the two into buying a gun. Unsuccessful, the undercover cop reports the teenagers to an FBI agent sitting in a black sedan. This is the making of Create and Capture. Create and Capture is the creation of informants where, allegedly, the FBI goes to lengths to outfit its targets with terrorist starter kits in order to manufacture and then foil terrorist plots. Malik and Naz sell various things, like Catholic saint cards, lottery tickets, and perfumed oils along Fulton Street to raise some cash. But it's their loving on each other cautiously in public that makes them illegible to the FBI, as depicted in the film. Their acts of loving on each other while moving throughout the city on the L train are cautious because of queer antagonistic surveillance by families, schools, and the public. In the film, this seeming illegibility then renders them only legible as all the more suspicious to the FBI agent in the black sedan. I want to hold on to the Maliks and the Nazes, but not Naz and Malik, the film, for how they allow me to think with what Sylvia Wynter calls the practice of decipherment in her essay, Rethinking Aesthetics, Notes Towards a Deciphering Practice. In this essay, Sylvia Wynter writes that a deciphering practice, quote, seeks to identify not what texts and their signifying practices can be interpreted to mean, but what they can be deciphered to do, and how. A deciphering practice is a way of getting at, as Ronaldo Walcott puts it in his discussion of the same essay, quote, a reconstituted universalism proffered from the vantage point of the subaltern and the dispossessed, end quote. Therefore, a deciphering practice moves towards making alterable our current epistemological order, rather than merely being a film or media criticism that enfolds into, as Wynter puts it, the instituting of the figure of the man. Black queer love in public makes possible an anti-colonial reading of the Maliks and the Nazes in the time of, for example, ongoing stop and frisk, the black site for police torture that was Chicago's Haman Square, the FBI's proposed shared responsibility committees, the FBI's Don't Be a Puppet website, and the Department of Homeland Security's monitoring of the movement for Black Lives. With this frame, I now turn to first the leaked intelligence reports by the FBI on the so-called Black identity extremist, and then briefly to the documentary Whose Streets, for the guideposts that that documentary offers for anti-colonial action. In this way, what follows is not strictly a comment on U.S. surveillance practices with regard to the so-called war on terror or on state and sanctioned violence against everyday Black life. Instead, by foregrounding Naz and Malik for the sake of the Maliks and the Nazes over the film itself, and asking what can this text be deciphered to do, what I'm suggesting is that Black queer love of Black people is a liberatory practice and a strategy for confronting the gendered violences of anti-Black police terror. This claim is not revelatory, of course. For example, the writings of Kathy Cohen, the art and activist work of Tulameen, or the Black Lives Matter Toronto's list of demands and their queer positive freedom school education program for children crafted through a trans feminist lens, or the Movement for Black Lives platform statement where that we are intentional about amplifying the particular experiences of state and gendered violence that Black, queer, trans, gender nonconforming women and intersex people face. By calling attention to loving Black people as a liberatory practice, it's to say that it's a deliberate enactment of anti-colonial politics against a colonial system in all of its makings: white supremacy, capitalist exploitation, white settler logics of indigenous dispossession and bureaucratic disavowal, anti-Black terrorism, heteropatriarchal violence, etc. Decolonial transformations can be fleeting sometimes. They morph and they mutate. They can become reincorporated or structurally readjusted, so to speak, in new systems of violence. I use the term anti-colonial here intentionally, as doing so calls attention to the continuous groundwork and deliberate acts of disruption necessary to hold the world that we want to get to someday to its promise of liberation. Prepared by the FBI's Domestic Terrorism Analysis Unit and dated August 2016, the leaked intelligence assessment brought with it the creation of a new classification, the Black identity extremist, which the FBI defined in a rather incomplete and confounding and probably deliberate fashion as individuals who seek wholly or in part through unlawful acts of force or violence in response to perceived racism and injustice in American society, and do so in the furtherance of the establishment of a separate Black homeland or autonomous Black social institutions, communities, or governing organizations within the United States. The document cites the killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri in August 2014, and the grand jury's non-indictment of the cop who killed him as the, quote, very likely impetus for the rise of this classification. This classification is now part of the FBI's catalog of the surveillance of Black life and the criminalization of Black political struggle. According to the leaked document, and here's a quote, the FBI assesses it's very likely that BIE's perception of unjust treatment of African Americans and the perceived unchallenged illegitimate action of law enforcement will inspire premeditated attacks against law enforcement over the next year. The leaked document continued by noting, this desire for physical or psychological separation is typically based on either religious or political belief system, which is sometimes formed around and includes a belief in the racial superiority or supremacy. The leaked document, of course, makes no reference to the quote-unquote alt-right movement or any other nomenclature that names white supremacist and white nationalist groups, organizations, and ideology, and their establishment or their calls for the establishment of a white ethno-state. I cite from the leaked document at length here to point to how it works as an FBI's power to index Black political struggle as an internal threat to national security, where this indexing becomes the state's alibi and its justification for the repression of any critique or responses coming from Black people when it comes to state violence against Black people in their communities. This leaked 12-page threat assessment is the documentary evidence of the sources and methods of the state's anti-Black surveillance. Nowhere in the threat assessment are any credible specifics around future violent acts targeted at police. Instead, it offers only the Black identity extremists as a category manufactured to trigger, or one could guess, the Bureau's counterintelligence tools, such as the recruitment of informants and other methods of discrediting and disruption. In the documentary Whose Streets, Brittany Farrell, co-founder of the St. Louis-based Millennial Activists United, calls for a different future, one that centers a Black queer critique of our current governing order. In this 2017 documentary, Farrell, along with her partner, Alexis Templeton, we follow them throughout their activist work or caretaking during the Ferguson uprisings and beyond. There's a highway shutdown, their wedding, a movement work within the city, community meetings with elected officials, Ferguson October, protests, disruptive acts, and loving acts. Millennium Activists United is a grassroots organization created by Black queer women. Their ways of caring demonstrate that Black queer revolutionary love can make possible by showing what it looks like to love Black people in public spaces, like their shutdown of the I-70 highway, where one motorist violently drove through the protesters' human barricade. This love is strategic and it is dutiful. They echo Assata Shakur's words throughout the documentary. It's our duty to fight for our freedom. It's our duty to win. We must love each other and support each other. We have nothing to lose but our chains. At one point during the documentary, Brittany Farrell outlines a method for a deciphering practice, to echo Winter here, when she says, I just want to challenge the ideas of normality. If your normal is limited opportunities for people of color, why aren't you questioning that normal? If that normal is 18-year-old teenager laying in the street for 4 hours, but that's your normal, right? Everybody wants things to be normal. I feel like if you're not questioning normal, you're not paying attention. And that's the end of the quote. We can take from Brittany Farrell's quote that if you're not questioning colonial forms of domination, then you're willfully not paying attention. Although Sylvia Wynter's essay on deciphering practice is focused on texts like film that shape the imaginaries of our current governing order, we can still look to it as a means of getting at a way of reading our present in the making of our anti-colonial futures, in city spaces and elsewhere. Or, as Brittany Farrell aptly put it in Whose Streets, it's that feeling that keeps me going.
Greetings, my name is Rona Capady. I am a professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and I'm so grateful to be joining you remotely today from the northwest side of the city of Chicago on the ancestral lands of the Three Fires Confederacy, which includes the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations and peoples. I first want to express my gratitude to the conference organizers, Adrien, Zakar, and Madiha Tahir, as well as everyone at Columbia and Riverside for making this virtual conference possible during these extraordinary times. I'm excited by the organizers' call to reflect critically on the technologies of power and substrates of empire as they've permutated it over the past 2 decades since 9/11, and with special consideration for the role that art and culture production have played in replenishing our political imaginations. We need these critical alternative knowledges now more than ever in the face of multiple overlapping global catastrophes, and especially after the calamitous events of 2020. After the events of blank. We use this formulation so ubiquitously in our speech, especially after 9/11, that other world-bending moment that changed everything and yet nothing at all. That spectacular occurrence that refracted all of the unresolved horrors of the 20th century's global Cold War into the new millennium. Exactly 2 decades later, an ever-expanding global struggle of regulating, managing, and warehousing populations continues mostly unabated across the heterogeneous terrain of the greater Middle East. Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Iran, Algeria, Syria, Palestine, Yemen, Somalia, Libya, Niger, and beyond. To say nothing of the numerous intertwined policing and security arrangements closer to home. It's difficult, if not impossible, to offer an appraisal of the astounding vision and strategic expanse of Washington's counterterror and counterinsurgent wars since 9/11. But it's clear that the logics of U.S. counterterrorism and national security now permeate the planet, underwriting an everlasting war, an everywhere war in Derek Gregory's terms, on the biosphere right on cue for the upheavals of 2020 and 2021, which threaten to amplify and exacerbate planetary inequality and injustice. Like 9/11, the COVID-19 pandemic has featured a double accelerant effect: group differentiated premature death and insecurity for the global racialized underclasses, and staggering accumulations of wealth and safety for the shrinking global ruling classes. As Wendy Brown swiftly summarizes, the pandemic intensifies existing vulnerabilities in a world ordered by the crude, careless power of nation states and capitalism. So in this context, how might we amplify the creative strategies that contemporary artists and cultural producers employ in service of insurgent struggles to end forever wars on terror and imagine otherwise? As I argued in my 2019 book, Insurgent Aesthetics, Security and the Queer Life of the Forever War, the sensorial and tactile registers in contemporary works of minoritarian and diasporic artists are antidotes to the atomizing tactics of U.S. counterinsurgency warfare in the greater Middle East. They offer queer and feminist methodologies of rebellion and freedom. The radical experiments, sensuous knowledges, and freedom dreams of contemporary minoritarian cultural workers respond to the state of forever war. Turning to the expansive world-making knowledge practices of contemporary Arab, Muslim, and South Asian diasporic artists in particular, what I call insurgent aesthetics, inaugurates new ways of understanding the politics of security and freedom from the perspective of those most dispossessed by U.S. war-making, as well as their diasporic kin. Unlike artists who forge works in the diaspora after years of living in conflict zones marked by direct embodied experience with the U.S. war machine and its client states, the majority of the artists I discuss in my book are instead diasporic subjects of surveillance societies in the West, differentially included within hierarchical orders of U.S. gendered racialization and militarized security, but not directly targeted by U.S. imperial warfare. We know that turning the tide against endless warfare necessitates an embrace of the radical imagination and speculative thinking of visionary artists to transport us beyond what Achille Mbembe calls the great chokehold of the present. Yet so much of the popular and scholarly criticism on late modern wars attunes so closely to the dominant strategies and technologies of national security that such work often has the unintended effect of making the state's frameworks and institutions seem monolithic and omniscient, even as that work seeks to assail war and empire. That global world order is in fact always already fleeting, fragile, and failing. Felicitous cracks have appeared in the surface of the U.S. forever war's architecture that are being exploited by forms of fugitivity, refusal, and rebellion. Diasporic visual and multimedia artists who hail from societies besieged by war, but who live and labor in the heart of empire, have made available new ways of knowing, sensing, and feeling that were once thought to be unimaginable. Indeed, cultural workers are producing what the sociologist Asef Bayat calls quiet encroachments, new tactics of protest that thrive in the underground and interstitial spaces to escape detection by the surveillance state. But often missing from prevailing accounts of art activism and criticism in the post-9/11 global war on terror era are the racialized bodies of minoritarian art practitioners themselves and their indispensable links to diasporic communities and social geographies most affected by U.S. global state violence in the greater Middle East. The insurgent aesthetics emanating from contemporary Arab, Muslim, and South Asian populations are vital to knowing the submerged histories of the forever war, not merely because these distinct minoritarian groups have survived, but because their works clarify the critical terrain of an ideological struggle. Take, for instance, the brilliant creative projects of the Brooklyn-based contemporary art duo, The Index of the Disappeared, comprising Mariam Ghani and Chitra Ganesh. In Afterlives of Black Sites 1, The Seen Unseen, The Index of the Disappeared offers an indictment of the visual and affective legacies of former CIA black site prisons. More than 100 secret prisons across 30 countries were operated by the CIA as part of an extrajudicial kidnapping, interrogation, and torture program during the Bush II era of the forever war. In this project, the artists assemble an even wider scope to suggest that any place that's been temporarily made invisible by tacit or explicit agreement to not see something that clearly exists, can also be understood as a black site, including, for instance, temporary holding zones used for extrajudicial interrogation, from Homeland Square in Chicago to the forward operating bases deployed by the US military. These artists evoke here the ongoing, enduring relation between the global wars on terror and the brutal domestic policing, surveillance, and imprisonment project perfected on racialized and migrant communities in the United States, bringing to light the so-called blackness and black worlds of the domestic and global ends of contemporary US state violence together. In a group show titled Mining Warm Data at the 2016 Dhaka Art Summit, the index's Black Sites 1 grappled with the recent dark pasts and presence of US empire. As their first significant artistic collaboration in South Asia, the exhibit at the Dhaka Art Summit provided an opportunity to reroute the index's venerable diasporic insurgent aesthetic collaboration in the US through a more intimate engagement with social geographies and non-Western life worlds targeted by the global ends of the US Forever War. The artists conducted field research in Afghanistan and former secret prisons, and collaborated with local LED and neon sign makers in Bangladesh in advance of the summit. The culminating installation included 8 photo light boxes, a series of signature watercolor portraits by Ganesh based on first-hand witnesses of the black sites, a short film by Ghani exploring how and why information that's widely known remains officially denied, and a large neon sign that pairs a poignant phrase from an official description of the first prisoner waterboarded by the CIA with the Bangla expression, covering a fish with greens, signifying an attempt to cover up something that everybody already knows. As viewers enter the installation's dark room, they are confronted with the blinding illumination of the neon sign with its bluish hue and the lightbox images, and are thus enveloped by the index's long-standing aesthetic concern with the interchange between visibility and invisibility and transparency and opacity. So given the many open secrets of the Forever War, including the use of black site prisons, the artists explore here the war's discarded landscapes and built environments just that are hidden in plain sight. They speculate on whether it's ever possible to view the ruins of a former black site without seeing it through the veil of its previous life in the unseen. In their field research, Ghani and Ganesh discovered that the feeling of looking at a place that was once a black site, but has now had any trace of that use removed or again hidden from view, is remarkably similar to the feeling of looking at a heavily redacted document. The surface opacity both frustrates the viewer who seeks concrete knowledge and underlines the importance of that which is concealed. So if a surface refers to the outermost boundary of an object, the artists here seek to penetrate that outer layer and conjure the innards of US empire lurking beneath. To replicate this sensorial disturbance, the index uses redaction patterns extracted from declassified documents, which they obtain from their long-standing archive about the geopolitical sites captured in the photographs, in order to alter their images in the Lightbox series. The aesthetic effect is a distorted and fractal view of the original landscapes photographed by the artists, a so-called collective hallucination that perfectly encapsulates what remains of knowledge in the wake of the Forever War. I argue throughout my new book, Insurgent Aesthetics, that the state uses abstract vision and limitless data to map racialized so-called Muslim populations and innovate surveillance and intelligence gathering procedures, while simultaneously disowning its imperial violence on a number of fronts, including its use of black sites, redactions of classified documents, so-called touchless torture of detainees, denials of civilian death counts and drone attacks, and so on. This imperial paradox of transparency and opacity in discourses of state security manifests both in the gendered racialization of Arab, Muslim, and South Asian refugee and migrant communities in the US, and in the insurgent aesthetic works like that of the Index, which cast light on the manifold unseen and disembodied technologies of secrecy and terror that define the Forever War. In outlining the space for alternative sensuous conceptualizations of the disavowals and disembodiments of state security, I demonstrate how these insurgent aesthetic practices inhabit dominant categories otherwise, thereby contesting the militarized tactics of US Forever Wars in the realm of contemporary art and culture. The index's Afterlives of Black Sites captures the U.S. security state's perennial preoccupation with officially denying that which everybody already knows, not least the many sites of carceral violence in its imperial wars. Warm data is an insurgent aesthetic strategy and reparative intervention that poetically limns the fissures, failures, and absences in visual archives of global military detention. What is hidden from view within the U.S. state's production of imperial transparency is a new imperial sensorium, a sensuous world of necropolitics that unfolds and engenders U.S. civic life. The index's warm data reveals how empirical ways of knowing political violence and war do not exist independently or outside the aesthetic and sensory modes that are equally central to U.S. warmaking. This interplay between transparency and opacity comes alive on the surface of art objects in this latest collaborative work by the Index. Its multiplicity of perspectives on the disturbed visual terrain of former black site prisons evokes what Karen Kaplan has described as, quote, not only the present absences, but the absent presences that a singular worldview cannot accommodate, unquote. So throughout my work, I mine this rich field of expressive culture and artistic responses to 21st century war making in a search for forms of aesthetic possibility that open up alternative ways of knowing, sensing, living, escaping, and feeling in the forever war. If the forever war is an assault on the human sensorium for citizens, subjects, survivors, and refugees of U.S. empire, I've chosen to center a queer and feminist analysis of the performative body of the racialized and dispossessed in order to reveal a complex insurgency against empire's built sensorium. The imaginative works of art that I assemble here reassemble vision with the disqualified knowledges, histories, geographies, and memories preserved by the so-called lower senses of empire's gendered racialized others. In so doing, I'm showing how minoritarian bodies serve themselves as critical sites for the acquisition of unorthodox and often unexpected political knowledge about security, terrorism, and warfare. A major goal of my book is not only to offer a diagnosis of how neoliberal security and wars have constrained dominant life worlds and accelerated human suffering via the atrocities of war, but also to elucidate how these artists provide the designs for sensing other, more disobedient and arresting ways of being in the world. To conjure the afterlives of black sites and forever wars is to imply that even as this imperial violence is not over and done, its shape and form have been transfigured. The forever war's flexible assemblages of tactics and strategies most certainly mutates by the day in the dystopian here and now. Despite decades of neoliberal security and warfare policies, the ascent of Trump, and the parallel rise of proto-fascist authoritarian regimes and political movements across the globe signals a continuation and a re-amplification of securitized violence. The botched efforts at nation building in Iraq and Afghanistan over the past 2 decades, combined with skyrocketing inequality, planetary destruction, and accelerated suffering across and within national boundaries, all attest to the spectacularly failed nature of the 21st century empire state and presage the ends of the American century. The search for alternative imaginaries and anti-imperialist designs amidst this era of accelerated American imperial decline could not be more urgent. This is the vital contribution of insurgent aesthetics alongside a broader constellation of radical acts and freedom dreams to imagine dissident modes of refusal, ungovernability, and fugitivity as the basis for a revitalized insurgency against the forces of neoliberal security and war. My book shows how culture and aesthetics participates in critical and transformative knowledge about America's global war making within and outside the borders of the United States. These aesthetic works can inspire social movements laboring to dismantle oppressive regimes of racism, heteropatriarchy, Islamophobia, empire, and class exploitation that are at the root of inequality, precarity, and violence in its many forms. So to sum up, the creative practices of conceptual artists like the Index of the Disappeared compels us to think, feel, and imagine otherwise about the manifold violences of the social world. A critical reading of their works of art allows us to better appreciate how the forever war's violently unfolding archives are repositories not only of data and information, but also of collective affects and structures of feeling that can elicit subjugated knowledge about the lives of the dispossessed, tortured, and killed across the transnational theaters of contemporary U.S. war making. In the end, the index's insurgent aesthetics open up other ways of knowing the carceral afterlives of war, destruction, and survival in the realm of contemporary art and culture. Their sensuous knowledge projects might further help us reckon with and reimagine anew our own intimate affective relation and collusion with the extraordinary renditions of US empire that are waged endlessly in our name. Thank you.
Please welcome me in, welcoming our speakers for this Q&A. Oops, that would be all right. For this Q&A session. We have questions for all of you, and we were really excited. We had a lot of fun sort of preparing this day. Today, the floor is open for questions. We'd love to get questions from the audience. We'll start with perhaps get the ball rolling with our own. And then we'd be happy to relay audience questions. So please don't hesitate to post. And so in a sense, I think this is working out beautifully because we're going to go sort of full circle. Rona just ended on telling us about collective affects and the role of affective mechanisms as a response for people who are targeted by who live in this world, let's say. And this is where I'd like to start with Nada. Nada, while speaking about the work of these Iraqi artists, your in a sense, your speech is clearly emotional. And I related to this, coming from similar areas that got utterly destroyed in the past years, perhaps more recently than Iraq. So we'd like you to say more about that. And let me tell you more. We wonder, how do our affective responses, such as yours today, or resonances mirror pains that constantly resurface in the present, in other words, trauma, while at the same time creating different forms of resistance and enacting certain forms of protest, right? So they're important in that other way. And here by protest, we refer to the original sense of protest from the Latin testor, which is to serve as testimony of something. So to what extent do our emotional responses, in a sense, can also serve as a form of testimony to this period of history that you just exposed to us?
Thank you. And, really interesting seeing all these talks coming together and how they support each other, and looking forward to this discussion that we will have. Trauma, this is, as you said, it's no longer just about Iraq, is a constant current as well as past sort of occurrence happening. And for Iraqis, for Iraqi artists, let's say, during the 1990s, they were dealing with trauma of the Gulf Wars, of the sanctions, in a very different way than they did in following 2003. Following 2003, there was a need to move on, to not look back, to not be in a transitional moment where I'm in Jordan, I'm in Amman, Jordan, but I have a foot in Baghdad, and I'm going to be back because we need to sort of fix our life, fix our environment. Following 2003 was, we can't deal with this anymore. We're moving on. I was told by several artists at the time, as I was trying to document looted works, to just forget it. And that's the past. The past is the past. We need to heal and not really relive the trauma. It was a very sort of confusing time for many of the Iraqis, because many Iraqis really did not believe that Saddam was dead. And they kept thinking he was going to come back. There were lots of conspiracy theories about Saddam being in the basement of the White House until the right moment. So that actually it kind of suspended time for Iraqis, not knowing how to deal with their what was happening to them at that moment, how to move forward, but how to look back. And is he really gone? Is the tyrant gone? But also, if he's gone, then where are we, and who's protecting us in any form? Because we seem to always forget, and this is exactly what I realized from the questions that I would get from journalists, or even from some colleagues at the time, that there's this sort of complete ignorance of how you survive under dictatorship. and what does it mean to also be isolated and cut off from the world. And so for those artists, particularly at that moment of total confusion, and April 2003, when and then even through June 2003, was really a moment of total confusion in Iraq. It was as if the invasion was a surprise to everyone, including the invaders, because they had not had a structure set up or not knowing how to move forward, which sort of, meant that people can use that moment of confusion to deal with things in their own way. It allowed me access to many things that I wouldn't have later. But for the artist, it meant that they can survey and write their testimonies, see what's happening, figuring out, because ironically, neither Hana Malallah nor Karim Rissan really intended to leave Iraq. They really wanted to stay in Iraq, but it became impossible for them to do so. And the trajectory of how their careers sort of developed after that, and their relationship to Iraq, which took a hiatus for a while, right? Until they figure out where they are and how they can sort of survive, was also different, because Hana Malallah was in Paris and then in London. Karim Rissan was in Damascus and then Toronto, where he is now living. And so that also meant their engagement with Iraq as a past, Iraq as a history, and Iraq as a new concept, as well as the art world, were very different. Now they're more actively engaging with Iraq. They didn't for about 10 years since after they followed or more, because of that we're witnesses, and they were witnessing what was happening and recording it, but they needed time to process. So the idea of protest, whether it is in the original sense or the common sense, had to kind of go through that process until they get to where they are now and understand how they can engage. And things have changed dramatically inside of Iraq, through this whole period that made even this involvement and the evaluation of the production very complicated.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And I think there's a lot of common themes here. One of them is these fleeting moments. I thought what you just said about Saddam Hussein is so interesting in terms of, Rona speaks about that, Simone speaks about these fleeting of empires, and we'll go back to that, but perhaps now let's transition to a question for Simone.
Yes, thanks again, all of you, and Neda especially also for kind of unpacking this question of protest, witness, testimony, and the different kind of embedded and embodied politics and affective responses that represents. At some point, we'd like to go back to especially the Fatar as a form of witnessing and testimony. But for the sake of time, I'd really love to ask Simone to unpack this question of decipherment. We were really struck by that as a concept, and I really love the way you utilize that in your talk. But I just want to quote you, just to kind of remind the audience, you say that a deciphering practice seeks to identify not what something can be interpreted to mean, but what it can be deciphered to do and how. So really, we're just asking if you could, just unpack that a bit for us, and especially if you could just tell us a little bit about, how can deciphering practices mobilize meanings in new ways? You've given some examples in your talk, but if you could just really kind of spell out a little more about how and when to play off different strategies in the right context, we'd love to hear more about that.
Thank you. So deciphering practice is actually from Sylvia Wynter and her essay on Notes on a Deciphering Practice. And I'm not a Wynter scholar, and so I won't take this opportunity to fumble the bag there with her work, but also point you to Ronaldo Walcott's article in Small Acts, Reconstructing Manhood. And in that, he talks about a deciphering practice as a way to think through the political inside of the aesthetic. And so what I wanted to take from that article, that essay from Sylvia Wynter, she does some analysis of the films Do the Right Thing, and also The Harder They Come. And the way that I pluralize the Nazes and the Maliks is a kind of an honoring of the way that she pluralizes the Ivanhoes and the Radio Rahims from Do the Right Thing. And so for her, it's about, I guess, it's about rethinking the norm, or what she might call man, or the normal man, and finding a way of thinking about what can aesthetics do? What are the, as Rona put it, what are the aesthetic possibilities of these texts, whether it is film or it is writings or other kind of counter signifying practices. And so for me, to look at those two films, not to take, Naz and Malik is probably not the greatest film, but I really thought that the ways in which they challenge the kind of bureaucratic and tailgating that the state does through the kind of opacity of their queerness, or how it was read by the state at that time, was an interesting a move and a kind of entry to that. But to see it, in this moment, I probably would think of two artists' work that I really, find really as just amazing. I don't know what the word is to think, something that is unnameable. And the first one is Asia Bundawi's documentary from 2018, The Feeling of Being Watched, where through a series of, Freedom of Information Act to request FBI files and something called vulgar betrayal in 1998. This is, as Rona just said, cover up something that everybody already knows. The neighborhood, the community, the family knew that the FBI was surveilling their community just outside of Chicago, but to have those documents and to have, she had to sue the government, and eventually still receiving thousands and thousands of these documents. And you see, it's a run a panel here about opacity, and as we heard earlier, opacity is basically the bureaucratic imperative, or the technologies through which the bureaucrats deny that very violence. When we come back with the files and their black boxers or opaque squares, and so some of the things that she tells us or shows us through the film is what we already knew: the tailgating that would happen, the disinformation, the way that the state the FBI had the power to index Muslim philanthropy as a threat to the state. And so the work that she does with that, and I'll just stop soon so we have a lot of conversations to have, is to annotate that, to have what she calls an inverse surveillance project, to annotate it with the stories, the what people already knew was happening, to tell a different story of that particular long history of the FBI's surveillance and indexing particular communities as national security threat to that work. So that's one space, and which I think this kind of deciphering practice through the aesthetic. And maybe another one would be the work of Sadie Barnett, artist who around 2015 was able to, through a FOIA again, to access the files of that the FBI had amassed on her father as one of the founders of the Black Panther chapter of Compton, Black Panther Party chapter in Compton, California. And again, it's seeing what we already know. But one of the things that she does in her practice with that work is to repair. By her own, Black annotation of the redactions, like redacting J. Edgar Hoover's name, and really, as she calls it, like raising the volume on the daughter's voice through the time-intensive labor of working out those files, and saying that is not the only, like the state's way of enumerating or naming threat. Whether it's through its disinformation or other kinds of violent campaigns, of the state, that's not the only story, but it's also a story of mourning, of grief, and of survival, and of Black radical activism as well too. And so I think those are the possibilities, of the aesthetic. When it is, Tony K. Bombara says the role of the artist is to make revolution irresistible. And you have also James Baldwin saying artists are disturbers of the peace. And I think this is what we see with the possibilities of, as Walcott puts it, to like rethink the political within the aesthetic.
Beautiful. I really appreciate the way you kind of added layers of complexity to that idea of deciphering practice.
And as that way, I kind of got away without giving a winter primer.
Yeah, but it's really just kind of, setting off all kinds of, neural connections as you speak. There's, I think, so much kind of embedded in that. And actually, one of the things that it's really kind of jogging me to think about also is something that, Adrien and I spoke a little bit about when we watched your videos earlier and kind of came up with some of these questions, right? And we're kind of meditating on this idea of opacity, particularly the idea that opacity can be a tool of domination, but also can be refracted and used, right, in alternative ways as a means of resistance, right? And so I'm really curious about that interplay, especially because we have so many, examples of sensory paradoxes about the seen unseen, the visible invisible, the officially unacknowledged, the transparent, and the opaque. And so I'm wondering, how that connects to questions of sensory derangements or rearrangements or disruptions in that way, right? As a political act. But that's one that's crucially mediated through this kind of aesthetic, insurgent praxis that, Rona, that you bring up. So I kind of want to just maybe transition to a question to, for you, Rona, as well, which is really connected to the part of your talk where you described the artist as experiencing, right, the same feeling when they visit a Black site as when they read a redacted or blacked out text. And I was wondering, how do you think, analytically about these various forms of confronting, and I'm using that con-fronting sort of terminology or accent sort of deliberately here. So confronting visibility and invisibility in this context, right? So in other words, I guess the question is put another way, do you think that confrontation necessarily entails other forms of sensory rearrangement? Is that the key here in terms of thinking about these vectors between the aesthetic and the political?
Oh gosh, let's talk about neural impulses. I'm bubbling up as I've been quietly, attentively listening to these brilliant comments from my panelists. Marwa, thank you for that question, and I really appreciate how you named the idea of opacity as a key word that is both about indexing something that the state is doing, right, as a tool of domination, but then also as a resistance strategy, as a methodology of rebellion. This is crucial to the work of the Index of the Disappeared, the artist that I talk about in the piece, and that I want to comment this a couple ways. First, to say that the concept of opacity is a key word in a lot of different fields right now. It's a key word in Black studies, in queer and trans studies, in a lot of different sort of disparate spaces, academically, intellectually, artistically. And so what's that about? I've been trying to think like what's going on there. It's both about an exhaustion of, and in confrontation with the limits of the politics of recognition, a recognition that capture by the state comes with all of these collateral effects. It's a recognition that the kind of espionage and unintelligibility and ungovernability that minoritized communities need to practice as a survival strategy as they move through the world is also an aesthetic. And that aesthetics is not only a theory of beauty and valuation, it's also a theory of relationality. And so, then thinking through, like, for me, especially in this project, Insurgent Aesthetics, like, I want to think of artists as theorists of the security state, as people who are not only doing the archival work of, getting all of those FOIAs together to, amass all of the documents of the torture FOIA, for instance, of the documents that have come out of Guantanamo and other US military prisons around the world, but that they're artists who are deeply invested in thinking through the changing tactics and permutations of state violence and war making in the 21st century. So that's the sort of sliver or constellation of artists that compel me, especially. And so I really appreciate, Simone, you naming Sadie Barnett and other people who who are thinking about the domestic ends of counterinsurgency throughout the long 20th century and the ways in which the state has been invested in punishing and surveilling and containing Black insurgencies in the North American context, because of course that is part of the global war on terror redux, we could say. It is part of the forever war machine, both the domestic and global ends. And so it turns out that, what Simone is talking about in terms of the reparative strategies of Barnett, the idea of annotation, that's precisely what I think the Index of the Disappeared is doing in their projects through the logic and language of warm data. They're trying to take something that is cold, that's bureaucratic, that is, steeped in ideas of administrative violence, and they're trying to wrench it open. They're trying to, make something bloom in a space, make something sensuous that is supposed to be cold and unfeeling. And I think when I first started working on this project, I was often trying to think about the knowledge of the security state in contradistinction from the knowledge that's coming from artistic communities. And what I realized by the end of working on this project is that actually this is part of the same aesthetic and political field, and that rather than thinking of cold and warm as dichotomous and in a sort of binary way, to actually think of them as part of this contrasting relation, to use the language from Rancière. The idea of a contrasting relation, because it's true that artists are invested in questions of affect and the sensuous, and this speaks to Nada's work in the 80s generation with the Iraqi artists that she looks at, but the state is also innovating ideas around the sensuous and the embodied. And so I just want to disturb, I think I appreciate what you said there, Marwa, about derangement, right? Because I think that's about, a reassemblage that is not creating new binaries, if you will. So I've I don't know if I've answered your original thread of your question, but I really appreciate the idea that opacity is proliferating in all these different ways as a technology, even as we see the limits potentially of it as we move on. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Rona. That was so illuminating, I have to say. And yeah, again, another sort of demonstration of adding layers of complexity on an original statement, and that's really much appreciated. As we mentioned at the beginning of today, last fall focused on formulating a diagnosis of the new technologies of power and their capacities to transform our world. Today, we wanted to move on and move forward towards emphasizing praxis, particularly as each of you focus on aesthetics as a critical form of praxis and resistance. Now, our question for all of you is that, are insurgent aesthetics confined to artistic production alone? Are there other arenas for these kinds of sensory engagements or embodied acts of resistance that one could practice in the everyday? And for instance, we can imagine forms of resistance through other forms of embodied practice. And how might we translate that for people who are in non-privileged spaces, where transparency is often a form of liability, for instance? So the first one of you who wants to jump in will appreciate. Perhaps we can go back to Nada if you feel comfortable, or
I think Rona should take this one first.
Okay, I'll be really brief because I'm conscious of time and it's the lunch hour. And I know folks are sticking with us and we started late, which is to say, yes, Adrien, in response to your question, yes, insurgent aesthetics can extend beyond artistic practice to other forms of political engagement. And I think, Simone, you shouted out the work of, the manifesto from the Movement for Black Lives and, the other forms of Black queer possibility in the work of Tourmaline and Kathy Cohen and, the Toronto Pride as instantiations, right? Examples of sort of otherwise possibility that extend beyond artistic practices and craft. And I think, as Nada has pointed out, that that generation of Iraqi artists are disconnected from their cocoon, as she puts it, from the kind of language and lexicon of the global contemporary. And in some sense, what we don't want to do is prioritize or exceptionalize artistic practices, especially by elite diasporic and minoritized practitioners who are able to navigate the global art market in this moment or in earlier moments, right? And recognize that actually all forms of culture making that are invested in a certain kind of insurgency they're not all going to look the same. They're not all going to be intelligible in the same kinds of ways. So we don't want to collapse the idea that, what someone makes for a gallery or a museum, that kind of work is the same as the kind of street performance or other form of cultural expression that circulates elsewhere. But I think we should be more promiscuous with the boundaries between art, activism, and other forms of knowledge making. So that's what I'll say to stop.
And if I would jump in and say, curating, is another form that one can extend, different ideas through. And so, which sort of might connect to the notion of deciphering, because then you're taking these aesthetic materials or non and doing something else with it. And then if you look at the work of Iraqi artists, there are different, through manifestos and through the produced work. But I think it's really important to understand that, and I think the world doesn't understand, and this is what I meant by that the Fatah is still not really understood for what they are. They're still looking for this sort of shiny object to, and the celebrated artist. And so, for example, Hana Malala has an amazing series of works. The Amriya shelter, for example, photographs that were in the exhibition at PS1 MoMA. And that in itself expresses that, it's a shelter, it was bombed, people died. We don't even know who these, who are all these people. And she was trying to document them like physically with some photographs or, empty spaces, name not known, or things like that. So there are different levels of complexity, even through representing the aesthetics.
Yes, and the first thing I thought of was, I guess, the summer of maybe 2020, and all of the various. The first thing I thought of was the March for Black Trans Lives that took place in front of, I was not there, but of course, the way that it kind of reverberated online, of that moment of grief, of mourning, but also of resilience and celebration and all the kind of complexities. And to say that the aesthetic, and I really liked how Rona talked about who can negotiate and navigate the global art market, but to say in these moments of crises that, mutual aid is also an insurgent practice as well too. You have the distribution by Miriam Kaba and the various organizations that she works with of zines that are educating us on the prison industrial complex, on mass incarceration and on abolition. And I think that is also part of the large insurgency that both of my panelists here are discussing as well too.
A question that we had originally for Ronak, but that we can actually, I think, ask to all of you, which is more of a trajectory question, I'd say, a biographical question. And so I'll ask the question to Ronak, but perhaps you can all answer. So we are curious to know how you got involved in this, very simply. When did you first encounter a Black site? Nada, when did you first see a daftar? And, was your academic and research trajectory, what was your academic and research trajectory? In other words, what is your story a little bit? Like we'd like to know more about where these engagements come from.
Oh boy, 2 decades after 9/11, right? We're in this moment where 20 years since the invasion of Afghanistan, Guantanamo opening. Next year will be 20 years since Iraq invasion. My entire adult life has been this period. I started college 3 weeks after 9/11, so my entire intellectual and political consciousness sort of emerged and inaugurated in the context of the early days of organizing against war on terror and all the detention, deportation, activism, and engaging with radical South Asian and Southwest Asian and Arab American and Swana organizing was the political milieu in which I sort of first entered into space. And so I knew that I wanted to marry an engagement with those political worlds with the kind of contemporary art performance, visual art worlds that I was also interested in. And I was meeting artists in those early days, you know, that generation of artists that is now proliferating and well celebrated in that contemporary global art market. That was not necessarily the case 15, 20 years ago. And still today, even as, you know, after the book has come out, feeling like, why is it that Arab, Muslim, and South Asian diasporic art practices, minoritarian aesthetics writ large, are not on the syllabi of people in art history or in performance studies or in visual studies who are innovating and interested in these questions. And so that constant lacunae, that constant feeling of there's all of this innovative work happening, all of this genius that's happening in this diasporic and transnational circuit that continues to not be part of conversations, even in all these retrospectives, 20-year retrospectives of the war on terror. And so I'm frustrated by that, and that's partly what propels me. But the other frustration is that in those retrospectives of the war on terror 20 years out, you very rarely hear about the centrality of art making and aesthetics to alternative ways of knowing war in the 21st century. It's completely evacuated still. It's still brought out as some cute thing, and as if art and aesthetics are epiphenomenal to the story about how we think through, you know, core questions about race and empire and gendered violence. So for me, I feel like these questions continue to be perennial, and I'm informed by the transnational women of color feminists who raised me up and trained me to think through these questions.
Yeah, I mean, everything that Rona just said. I mean, you know, the idea, it all started actually when I said I wanted to study modern Arab art as a topic, you know, to do my research, my PhD, and then was told that doesn't exist. And I mean, this is 1990. So, you know, I share and I hear Rona's frustration, but I think actually now it appears on some syllabi. So we are definitely have moved on. But when I started, this idea of the visual production of this other there in the Arab world didn't exist. Art wasn't there. I mean, till today, it's not in the Western canon. It is not evaluated as an equal form of knowledge. It is still seen by many as an imitation or a lesser. And so there's a lot more work to do, but we definitely have courses that we're teaching. Of course, you know, having left Iraq right before the Iraq-Iran war, and seeing the succession of wars that have taken place. I have a Palestinian mother, so I grew up listening to, you know, the radio continuously. And I actually was in Baghdad following 1967. I was a kid, but, you know, I remember when our neighbors, our Jewish neighbors, were told us that they're going to have to leave because they were told they had to leave. And yeah, like all these sort of events that I have witnessed, and then witness inside and that witness outside. And, you know, we used to joke and say that, oh, well, my mother doesn't have a country, but at least my father did. Well, you know, then it became no one had a country. But first time I encountered the daftar was in June 2003 when I carried two of them out of Baghdad to London. And I was so frustrated by the fact that no one at the airport said, what is this thing you're carrying in a plastic shopping bag, leaving the country at a time when the country was being looted from everywhere? And I'm do you not see what I have in my hands? But they didn't seem to care. Why? Because it was contemporary art, which, and so they didn't understand it till today. State Department, you know, all the sort of agencies don't really understand how to stop and confront contemporary art because they don't know what it looks like, or modern art for that matter, even more complicated because it could look like anything. And so, I mean, the lack of its representation, its understanding, why is it this thing I grew up with and saw all around me and evaluated as, you know, rich and high, not existent in my new sort of life, was what pushed me into wanting to know more and study it more, and then, you know, publish about it and teach about it and understand how, in fact, it helps us understand modernism at large, you know, and to be able to decenter the notion of European modernism as the sort of the roots or the beginning of it, because, you know, clearly we have lots of evidence that say it's not.
It's a very loaded question, Adrien. So this is the best I can do in such a short moment.
Thank you so much.
So
Simone?
great question. So I started my PhD in 2001 in September, and at the time I was interested in doing a kind of history of the passport. And there have been, many histories of the passport. There have been many dissertations on Plato's Republic, and I was fine with going in like that. But then in October of that year, the Canada government, a minister of immigration, went to the US-Canada border and held up this prototype of a new document, and it was said to be the most secure document in the world, and it was secured by way of biometric technology. And she said, we're not going to allow our borders to be, whatever, by terrorists, by economic terrorists, quote unquote. And the card that she had was a picture of a seemingly white woman, but the country code was LKA for Sri Lanka and also a Tamil last name. So a lot of things were going on there around race, around gender, around who this so-called nation needs to be protected from economically. But also that this card was like ready to go, and so the idea that 9/11 was also a moment where there was this, alibi of ratcheting up a large outspending of the military industrial complex and the kind of ways that biometrics became that which will secure the border. And so that is how I started, and it's it's the changing same, but now we see that biometrics are on our phone, and what we're doing right now. But that was my interest story in the making of the border, in kind of anti-immigrant politics and policies, and biometric technologies as a changing same.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. We'd like to thank really warmly all of our panelists. We understand that a Zoom event in January 2022 is not where you'd like to be. And so we really appreciate it that you joined us and were so kind to answer our questions. I'd like to have a special thank you to Madiha Tahir, who did not join us today, but we think of her. And we thank her for all her work on the Technologies of Power series. And we'd like to thank also the faculty members that have been supporting us, including Marwa Elshakry, who was our co-host today, Manan, Ahmed, and Brinkley, Messick. Technologies of Power was made possible with the support of the Dean of Humanities at Columbia University, the Center for the Study of Muslim Societies, and the Department of History and Anthropology and the Middle East Institute. And of course, through our current institution with Madiha and I, the Arizona State University and the University of Toronto. Thank you for joining us, and stay tuned for our next event in a couple of weeks. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, folks.